Seems to me if we were going to do that and we were going to use taxpayers' money, we certainly should have had provisions in there that controlled the way that money was going to be spent because it was taxpayers' money. And when you talk about these huge bonuses, it seems to me they could have put a lid on some of that. So, but we should have gone through the bankruptcy procedure, in my opinion. With that, let me yield to my colleague.
Thank you. I thank the gentleman for yielding. I want to ask from this side of the aisle, because I think your answer was good, and I want to make sure both sides have asked it. If I understand correctly, you said everyone got a bonus, and clearly, in your opinion, not everyone needed to get a bonus in order to be retained, or if they weren't retained because they didn't get a bonus, they could have been replaced, including, as Mr. Cummings, I think, alluded to, you know, basic clerical personnel who had no special skills. Is that correct?
I do believe that.
So, very clearly, somebody who made the decision to give these bonuses made a decision that was in the best interest of making everyone happy and not the best interest of the American taxpayers or even AIG. Is that correct?
I think that at the time these contracts were entered into, it was before the government bailout, but ultimately, yes, the decision was made not to try to renegotiate these payments and go forward with them. That is correct.
Okay. I want to go back down a track for a moment. You made a decision not to speak directly with some people in the chain of command who may have talked to somebody at the New York Fed about these bonuses prior to the document production. And I know you said sometimes people withhold documents, but if I understand correctly, individual members of the board, the then president, the first vice president, and the executive vice president may not have been asked. They were in place at that time. Did you speak to anyone at the Fed or even at Treasury about these bonuses prior to the date you currently know of? Is that correct?
I don't have the exact list of people that my audit team interviewed. However, again, I think we followed this information to its appropriate conclusion.
Okay,
of those who were informed.
Then can I ask that as a supplemental, and I'll put it in writing if you need it, but that each of these individuals who were in place at that time be asked, what did you know, when did you know it, and who did you tell? That each of those people, if they haven't been asked personally, not document production, but personally, if they knew about it and or if they spoke to anyone at the Fed, if each of these people could be interviewed either through interrogatories or actual interviews, and you could get back to us so we could be satisfied that these people who, to me, logically are part of the trail that has to be followed, have been followed.
If you would send us a letter, I would be happy to forward that communications onto the Federal Reserve and FRBNY and be happy to report back the responses.
Okay, and then last, if we'd gone through ordinary bankruptcy, obviously FP would not have made everybody whole unless the government threw the money in. But let me ask one final question. The individuals who received the greatest amount of these bonuses, the ones that really trigger our inquiry today, they negotiated basically paying 100 cents on the dollar. Where was the expertise in unwinding used to pay less than 100 cents on the dollar when, in fact, these products in their market, those who unloaded these products prior to getting 100 cents on the dollar, unloaded them for anywhere from a nickel or a dime up to maybe 40 cents on the dollar? Where was that expertise used, if anywhere?
That is a tremendously important question, and we're going to be addressing it in an audit that we're going to be putting out next month that studies the counterparty payments and the decision by the Federal Reserve to pay 100 cents on the dollar. So I look forward to sharing that audit with you, and of course would be happy to come back and testify about that audit.
Thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Kucinich.
Thank you very much. Mr. Borofsky, when did the last administration become aware of AIG bonus and retention plans? Was it before or after the $85 billion bailout?
It would have been after the September bailout, the September infusion of $85 billion from FRBNY.
On page 11 of your audit report, you state that the New York Fed spent months after October 2008 influencing changes to future compensation decisions. Exactly what influence did they have over AIG compensation decisions, and did the officials make the decisions for AIG?
We're going to be studying that issue a lot more closely on corporate governance. It's an audit that we have pending right now. We're doing in connection with GAO. It's going to really look at the government's role in making those types of governance decisions.
Thank you. Now, during this period, did officials from the Federal Reserve use their influence to try and streamline AIG's compensation structure so it would be easier to understand and manage?
Yes, they worked with AIG with a consultant to get a better sense of what the entire structure was, and advising AIG to make a better, more comprehensible structure.
During the testimony in front of the House Committee on Financial Services on March 24, 2009, Secretary Geithner and Chairman Bernanke both admitted that they had seen AIG's SEC filing and knew a great deal of information in the public domain regarding AIG's excessive bonus programs. However, neither of them claim to have known about the retention bonus plans for AIGFP employees until March 10, 2009. Now, have you examined AIG's SEC filing in early September 2008, and if so, were the retention bonus plans for AIGFP employees included in that filing?
Generally speaking, I think that they would have been aware of those bonus plans. I think the testimony was the specific size and scope of the amounts that went out in March of 2009, earlier this year.
Well then, given Mr. Geithner's heavy involvement in the bailout of AIG as the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, now Mr. Borowski, it's really hard to believe that he wasn't informed of the retention bonuses for AIGFP employees prior to March 10th, especially since they were awarded retention bonuses of $69 million in December 2008. Was Mr. Geithner informed of the bonus plans, and if not, why not?
I think we have not seen evidence that he was informed of the size and scope of these retention plans. As to the why not, I think that he should have been. I think it was a failure, again, as I said before, a failure of management. The one explanation that I would offer is the one I offered earlier, which is to a certain extent the Federal Reserve officials who were looking at this just didn't identify it as significant an issue as it really was, and that may have contributed to their failure to raise it up.
I think it's really important for members to regard closely what Mr. Borowski just said, because there's legislation in another committee that would give the Fed even broader jurisdiction in matters relating to the economy, and they can't even handle simple things like being able to keep track of bonuses that are going out the door at a time that they're being asked and the Fed's being asked to pump money into the economy to prop up the AIGs of the world. Now, Mr. Borowski, did you come across any information that would explain why these Federal Reserve Bank of New York officials did not immediately inform Mr. Geithner about the payments? Why didn't they tell him?
What they explained to us was in substance, they didn't think it was such a big deal. $168 million was a drop in the bucket. Their concern, their focus was on repaying.
Think about that bucket.
No, it's a big bucket. But their concerns were misplaced. I mean, frankly, this was sort of the problem of the outsourcing of oversight to an entity that just doesn't have this political sensitivities, particularly at that time, that you would expect from Treasury, of looking at this not from just a dollars and cents of moving the beads on the abacus, but of the more fundamental questions that we're addressing, which is it fair, is it right to give $168 million to the very individuals who are responsible for driving that company into the hole that it was, that put it on the brink of bankruptcy?
Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Borowski, the Constitution of the United States makes it very clear that the power to coin money and regulate the value thereof is reserved to the Congress. Now, we gave that away in the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, but we better look twice before we consider giving the Federal Reserve any more power, and we should also consider whether or not it's time for Congress to try to make up for some of the damage that was done to the American people by outsourcing our money supply and the supervision of it to the Federal Reserve. They can't keep track of small matters, let alone large matters. Time for us to start thinking about changing the direction we have with that institution. I thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Thank the gentleman from Ohio for his statement. I now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Tennessee.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I agree with the comments that most of the people have made here today, Mr. Burton and Mr. Kucinich both, and I think there's widespread agreement, and I think almost all the American people just think these bonuses are ridiculously excessive, but we're talking today more specifically about the AIG bonuses, and the AIG bailout funds, according to the timeline and sheet briefing that we've been given, totaled $180 billion. Is that correct?
The total commitments add up to $180 billion.
I mean, that's a mind-boggling figure that nobody can really humanly comprehend, but several companies, some banks and companies have paid back some of the bailout money. Do you know how many have paid back of the companies or the banks or the firms that got bailouts?
The precise number will be in our quarterly report next week. I don't have the number at my fingertips. It's about $70 billion or so, but I don't remember the exact amount of what it is right now.
How much of the $180 billion has AIG paid back?
I think the total amount that's outstanding, according to GAO's most recent report, is about $120 billion outstanding of the $180.
$120 billion. And the bonuses that we're talking about, they wanted to pay $243 million in bonuses. Is that correct? It's
for AIG FP. It was about $60 million in December, the 168 that in this March, and another 198 that's due next March.
So how much is that in total?
It's a little bit over 400. 450. A little over $400 million.
So it's $400 million. In one of our papers, it was talking about just the $243 million. What is the largest of those bonuses? How large are those bonuses?
I believe that they went up to $4 million for an individual.
$4 million for an individual. And then in your report it says that the Treasury put down these rules and said the annual compensation limit of $500,000 proposed by Treasury in February 2009 was not retained. That's correct?
That's correct.
And then bonus payments to senior executive officers are limited to 1/3 of total compensation. What is the highest compensation that's being received by AIG, somebody at AIG at this time?
I'm not sure of AIG overall. I know recently the pay package for the new CEO of AIG was recently approved, and I think that could be with incentives of up to $10 million.
What's how much?
It's $10 million
with
various incentives if he meets all his incentives. I think that's approximately the number. I don't have the number right before me.
Well, I agree with all these others that these bonuses, first of all, these bailout funds shouldn't have been paid. We shouldn't have gone in this direction. But even National Review magazine had an editorial comment that said, and they said that they ordinarily wouldn't be in favor of the government being involved in the compensation of any private business, but when a business had accepted a bailout money, that they saw justification for limiting salaries and bonuses in that situation. And I certainly agree with that, and I think about 99.9% of the American people agree with that and feel that these bonuses have been ridiculous and excessive. Thank you very much.
Thank you, gentleman from Tennessee. I now yield 5 minutes to the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Watson.
Much. According to an article in the Wall Street Journal yesterday, the moves made by Kenneth Feinberg, the special master for compensation at the Treasury Department, to more clearly tie compensation to long-term performance are aimed squarely at salaries, not bonuses, which are restricted by rules passed by Congress earlier this year. Do you agree with the Wall Street Journal's assessment that there's a legal differentiation between an executive's salary and their bonuses, and that Kenneth Feinberg's authority is limited only to their salary?
I think that I really defer to his office for their current definition of their authority, but I think that his jurisdiction and scope is fairly broad. There are certain legal limitations that he's operating under. For example, bonus programs or programs that were executed prior to February 11th are specifically exempted from the statute of being controlled by the executive compensation restrictions that are in ESA as amended. But with that said, there is an amount of leverage that comes with being a significant equity owner of these companies, and I think that Mr. Feinberg views his role broadly and it will be making advisory opinions that beyond just the scope of what's completely spelled out in the statute.
Recent news reports have stated that Mr. Feinberg is planning to shift a portion of an employee's annual salary into stock that cannot be accessed for several years to better tie pay to performance in the financial sector. However, some have made a counter-argument that making stock a part of an executive's annual salary creates an incentive to boost the stock price in the short term rather than focus on long-term shareholder value. Do you agree that tying compensation to stock will create this counter-intuitive short-term incentive?
I think a lot of that depends on the terms and conditions that are associated with the bonus payment. I think that is a legitimate concern, but perhaps it's one that can be addressed by the way the restrictions are spelled out.
You know, when you, in your opening statement, you said it was a mess. These things are getting, that's why we're trying to get detailed with it, because it is a mess. And as I said before, it's like trying to unscramble rotten eggs. So can you recommend any other guidance for how to structure compensation so that it encourages reasonable and sustainable work performance?
I think what we'll do and what we'll continue to do is to try to bring as much transparency to this process. It's ultimately not our role to make the policy decisions, but it is our role to bring as much transparency to the decision-making process so that you, the policymakers in Congress, and the policymakers in the executive have all this information available to them to evaluate those decisions and tweak them, whether it's through different policies and procedures by Treasury or through legislation of this body, and we'll continue to fulfill that role.
And according to your report, despite promises from AIG that they would attempt to recover some of the $165 million worth of bonuses paid in March, so far they have only recovered $19 million of the $45 million they asked recipients to repay. And apparently part of the problem is that some employees resigned so they could keep their money instead of returning it. So can you explain why, if AIG was contractually obligated to pay the bonuses as part of retention bonus plans agreed on in January 2008, the employees are not obligated to continue working for AIG in order to receive the extra money?
There are, in the agreements, there are, once they receive the retention payment, they can leave. And that would, if they quit, they wouldn't be able to receive the future retention payments of 2010. However, if they are fired, and they're fired not for cause, they still are actually entitled to receive retention payments, and approximately 50 or so of those who received the retention payments in March of this year were not working at AIG-FP at the time they received those payments because they fell into that category of people who had been fired but not for cause.
So they are sticking to the contract rather than the thoughts of trying to repay us who bailed them out that money. The employees left, and so their performance is no longer there for anyone to review, but they have the money and got away with it.
That's correct.
The gentlewoman's time has expired.
Well, I'll continue at another time. Thank you.
Okay. And now yield to 5 minutes to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. McHenry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Borowski, thank you again for your testimony. We've seen a good bit of you as of late here on financial services as well, which I'm a member of. Thank you for your frank and honest testimony. You know, let's rewind a little bit. And I know the ranking member had some questions about who you interviewed in that whole process. But it's clear you did not interview Secretary Geithner as a...
You know, my audit team interviewed Secretary Geithner on a number of different audits. I don't believe that they asked questions about this specific issue during that interview.
Okay. Did did your investigators interview Sarah Dahlgren, who was Geithner's top bank supervisor at the New York Fed?
Yes, we did.
Yes.
Extensively.
Okay. Were any questions posed to her whether or not her boss was informed of this?
Yes. She informed us that she had not informed then-President Geithner.
Okay. As head of the then-President of the New York Fed,
Yes.
Geithner. Was the Treasury staff, did they report that they provided then-Secretary Geithner with this information?
Not until March 10th.
Not until March 10th. Okay, so it seems either a colossal failure of administration through either error or omission or willful ignorance in some cases. And it seems to me that Secretary Geithner is a pivotal player here as both the head of the New York Fed, which had direct action, is that correct, with the AIG bailout in the fall of last year?
That's correct.
That's correct. And he was a key decision maker in the winter and spring of this year about the AIG bonuses as well. Is that correct?
Yes, he was clearly, from the time as the president of FORBNY, there was a brief period of time where he recused himself from matters from after then-President-elect Obama identified him as the future Secretary of Treasury until he became Secretary of Treasury. He had recused himself from some of those matters. But other than that window, basically from September until the present, in one job or the other, he was the head of an organization that was involved in the bailout of AIG.
Okay. And according to your report, the Treasury failed in its oversight of AIG compensation generally. Is that true?
That's correct.
Okay. So it's kind of interesting to me, as a part of an oversight panel, that we have, as Secretary of the Treasury, someone who not only failed in his oversight and actions about the bonuses as Secretary of the Treasury, but in his job immediately before that, and he did recuse himself as of November 24th when the President nominated him, you're correct. But it also seems to me that he failed as head of the New York Fed in terms of having oversight of this. In fact, these bonuses and these retention payments were a matter of public disclosure to the SEC by AIG. So it was in the public purview by then, was it not?
I mean, yes, and I think much like if anything goes wrong in my organization, I'm responsible and it's my failure. Since we are criticizing both the Federal Reserve and the Treasury for failures of communication, management, and oversight, of course he's ultimately responsible.
Certainly. Well, I appreciate your frank testimony there. And you've been a straight shooter all along, which I don't think it's not a partisan issue. I mean, both parties are involved in this chaos, it seems to me. But additionally, you have oversight over the PASAR, the Special Master for Compensation, Ken Feinberg's operation. Is that correct?
Yes.
Their operation in terms of reworking these retention bonuses, could that have a negative impact on the government's repayment of funds from AIG?
It is possible. One could envision a scenario that if there really is one person who's so important, so vital to unwinding these transactions and has such a level of information, and a decision is made that results in that person leaving, it is theoretically possible. Now, whether those facts are true or whether it will play out that way, I don't know. I'm not in a position to say, but it is certainly at least theoretically possible.
Does your office have a plan for oversight of this PASAR and their operations?
We have a number of audits under consideration as we staff up. One of them that I've certainly have discussed with my audit staff will be an audit of the PASAR. We're not announcing it yet. We want to sort of see what happens, and that way we can better structure the audit, make sure that we ask the right questions and do it in a correct way. But I do anticipate that we will be auditing that process, almost certainly.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your testimony.
Gentleman's time has expired. And now you have 5 minutes to the gentlewoman from Washington, D.C., Ms. Eleanor Holmes Norton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for these important follow-up hearings on this matter of great concern to this committee. Sir, I am intrigued by the legal basis for your conclusion that AIG was required by law to distribute these bonuses. Now, my concern comes from not only my own specific concern, but one that has also been voiced by the Attorney General of the State of New York, Andrew Cuomo. Understand that I'm trained as a lawyer to respect the sanctity of contract. So I don't ask this question lightly, but nor, I think, did Andrew Cuomo ask it lightly. And he apparently sent a letter to the chairman of Financial Services, Mr. Frank, in which he takes on your conclusion that these bonuses were legally required. I could not help but smile at a line in his letter that he wondered whether AIG attorneys, quote, considered the argument that it is only by the grace of the American taxpayers that members of financial products even have jobs. Now, I was intrigued by Attorney General Cuomo's analysis, and I wonder if you considered his arguments before drawing your own conclusions. For example, AIG, which by contract apparently was to pay people certain salaries, they seem not to have had trouble renegotiating those salaries, which surely weren't orally pronounced. They renegotiated those contracts, but when it came to these retention bonuses, the law didn't allow such renegotiation or change. And I wonder if you could indicate your view of these arguments, some of which are in Mr. Cuomo's correspondence.
Sure. I think there's two different parts here. First is whether this was a legally binding contract, and based on what we report on is the different legal opinions that Treasury received, AIG counsel, from its own counsel, from the Department of Justice.
Yeah, I know the conclusion, sir.
No. May I continue? The second part of your question, which is a far different one, was, well, could they have renegotiated? And I think the answer to that question is of course they could have renegotiated.
Should they have?
I think the fact that right now I'll answer that question by what's going on right now, which is basically Mr. Feinberg is encouraging them to renegotiate, and they, as we detail in our audit, they are.
Well, should they have renegotiated? This is what caused outrage. This is what is making it hard for more funds to come through here. Let's hope we don't have another rolling crisis here.
Right, and I think that's.
And if they're doing that now, does that not indicate that they should have renegotiated these bonuses rather than arguing that by law they had to pay them? Because if by law they don't have to pay them now, how could they have by law had to pay them then?
And I think your point is very well made, especially when you look at the bailout in context. And certain times we say contracts are inviolable, and this is a binding legal contract, and therefore it has to be followed. But if you look at it in context with other parts of the bailout, whether the auto industry, whether it's contracts with auto dealers or contracts with debt holders, sometimes contracts are compelled to be renegotiated and terms are changed. So I think your concern is right, and should not confuse our finding that while this was indeed a binding contract, there was an offer and consideration and performance, the three elements of any contract. That's not to say that that was the correct move to just say that this is a binding legal contract, here's your check, thank you very much. That's not our conclusion at all. And
what is your conclusion? I mean, I don't know why you would simply have endorsed their conclusion that, well, these were legally binding contracts, and then you cite others who found those contracts. I want you to know that American people say, are you crazy? would these people, for example, have had any bonuses had they lost their jobs, which they retained by the grace of the taxpayers? So your answer seems to be that, yes, they could have renegotiated them. I don't know why that wasn't your conclusion in the report, so that people would have understood there's real oversight going on here, that there were alternatives, that people losing their jobs and their bonuses here can expect that people in high places who had their money would also be required to do so.
Our conclusions, I think, make pretty clear, and we point out that, first of all, we were asked the question, we answered the question, was this a legally binding contract? And the answer to that question is based on these various people that it is. But the question that you're asking is, why didn't we suggest what are alternatives? The answer is that we do in our audit. We specifically note one opportunity that was lost as far as government leverage was the fact that $30 billion more of taxpayer money was coming down the pike in March of 2009. And this would have been an opportunity to go back and compel a renegotiation. So I think
that leverage which was in the hand of management
so
was not used in behalf of the taxpayers.
Yes, and I think that your concerns are addressed in our audit report. We do report, as we were required to do, on the basic legality of whether or not there was a contract. But I think our audit makes clear that just because it was a legally binding contract didn't mean that there were not other alternatives available to AIG and the federal government that didn't take place, and that these options are still on the table and are being pursued with respect to the next tranche of payments in March of 2010.
Mr. Bill Bray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I like to just echo the frustration of the delegate from the Federal District over how a lot of this was handled. I guess we just got to be reminded this is exactly the problem with big government thinking that we're going to use that to hold big business accountable, and the taxpayer and the little guy seems to get stomped in the long run. And so I do echo the delegate's frustration there. At this time, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to yield my time to the ranking member from California.
I thank the gentleman. You know, your oversight and your testimony time and time again are critical, and sometimes the most critical part is when we revisit what you previously had been working on and perhaps not satisfied. The last time you were before us, you had deep concerns and had in your previous report, and particularly as to the public-private investment program. And particularly as to the absence of a firewall and self-dealing, including, I guess, BlackRock, who is being paid on one side and can still invest on the other. Have changes been implemented so that those concerns are less, and if so, could you tell us how?
Overall, no. There have been some changes. We're going to detail them in our report that's coming out next week, but walls have not been implemented. So
self-dealing is still possible with taxpayers' money?
It's an extreme risk, and with absent these ethical walls, it maintains a strong risk that we're going to be paying very careful attention to.
Have you reviewed Secretary Paulson's telephone records that have now been released?
I personally have not.
Well, we looked at them briefly, and what we discovered was that his phone logs show that he was talking to obviously Secretary Geithner a great deal, but also to now President Barack Obama. It appears from those records as though the transition had occurred by November, that in fact the majority of the calls were being made to the incoming administration, not to the outgoing. Would that surprise you?
Those events occurred before I was even sworn in, so
but you're now looking back on who knew what and when did they know it, and how were the mistakes continued to be made. Is that an area that you think is within your purview to continue looking at?
Oh, if it's related to a specific TARP issue, absolutely. We saw no indication that that anyone at Treasury, including Secretary Paulson, knew about these AIG bonus payments, you know, at that time, so that that wouldn't have been part of this audit. But it's certainly within the scope of potential future audit products, absolutely.
Now, I want to follow up on what Delegate Norton had said, because I think what she hit on in your answer needs one more, if you will, filling out. Even though there's billions of dollars more coming from the federal government, don't we at the dais have, if you will, a self-fulfilling prophecy? We've determined at that time this is too big to fail. and the government will put any and all money in necessary. So if the government did not put in more money at the time when they could have used it as leverage, if they said, look, if we don't get negotiated down cost, we're not going to put the money in, wouldn't that basically have said, you go into bankruptcy if you don't do it? And didn't the employees basically all know that that was a false statement if we had made it, that we had written a blank check? We'd given the President and the Fed walking around money that was virtually unlimited.
I think there's certainly a lot to that statement. I do think there's a tremendous amount of leverage when you're going to be continued to make additional payments and put in conditions. And I think a good example of that is in the auto industry, where the federal government, through the TARP, had made billions and billions of dollars of support to Chrysler and to General Motors, but then went back with the threat of bankruptcy to force very significant concessions.
Right. But in that case, of course, we ultimately put them in bankruptcy after we'd had the political bankruptcy. And I know that's not within your direct testimony today, but isn't it true basically that we put money in that we'll never get back in a political bankruptcy before the actual bankruptcy occurred, or, if you will, the sale of Chrysler to Fiat and the whole refunding of General Motors?
I share your skepticism about the likelihood of getting that money back, the early money back.
And by the way, just as an old car guy, do you actually think that Fiat has technology that Chrysler didn't have?
That is well beyond the scope of any current audit product that we have.
Thank you, but I figured it was worth a smile. Thank you. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much for being here, Mr. Borowski.
Thank you.
For the better part of the year, it has been painfully evident to the American people that AIG has been due an audit. After using taxpayer dollars to bail out an insurance company that was once the largest in the country and possibly in the world, AIG used those same taxpayer dollars to reward the culprits of its corporate collapse. We cannot afford to be frivolous with hard-earned income of our citizens. Following the decline of AIG's stock value in 2007, employee compensation packages were adjusted to account for the loss in value of existing plans. These changes reflect AIG's ability to negotiate compensation benefits with its employees and suggest that AIG could have done the same in light of its federal assistance. Why did bonuses and retention awards continue to be included in compensation packages even after AIG received a federal bailout from the pockets of American taxpayers? Why did that persist?
You know, that is a vitally important question. The explanations that we've received that we report in our audit was essentially was what we've heard, which is this notion of the sanctity of the contract. But I could not agree more with your statement that, of course, there was an opportunity to renegotiate these agreements, both then and as is going on right now.
According to your findings, the 2008 bonus plan for senior partners was restructured in October of last year. According to this new plan, a portion of the bonuses would be paid only if the company had been sufficiently reorganized, progressed in repaying federal monies, and cut the 2008 bonus pool by 30%. How many of these stipulations were met?
I'm not sure how many of those stipulations had actually been met on that issue. That's outside the AIG FP issue, but on the TARP bonus structures. I think, though, a lot of those rules and restrictions have been superseded by ARA and by the mid-June Treasury regulations, and I think that the decisions about the pay plans for the top 100 employees at AIG are going to be determined by Mr. Feinberg. But I can follow up and get more information on that.
And could you tell us how much of the $150 billion federal rescue package has been repaid?
Right now, the current amount outstanding to AIG is about $120 billion.
I see. Retention payments to AIG FP. What justification has AIG given regarding the pay and retention awards to the FP division, the division central to AIG's demise?
The two arguments that have been advanced are, one, again, that this was a binding legal agreement and therefore they were compelled to do so. The second argument is that employees at AIG FP, some of them were essential because of their unique knowledge to unwinding the complex transactions that occurred. As noted earlier, neither one of these arguments is entirely satisfying.
Yeah, and then, I mean, it even got to the absurdity of retention awards being paid to non-essential staff, including almost $8,000 to a kitchen assistant and $7,000 to a mailroom assistant. What was the justification for that?
We're still waiting to get a justification for that. I think, again, that falls back into the first point, that these were legally required under contract is the justification. Again, it's not one that we share or find particularly satisfying, but that's the explanation.
Were the retention programs successful in retaining these employees?
Certainly there are a number, there's still AIG FP employees, whether or not they're still there because of these retention payments or because of the realities of the job market, or maybe the realities of having AIG FP on your resume may not make you the most attractive potential employee. It's difficult to determine.
Can you share with the committee how many resigned despite receiving a retention award?
I don't have that number right handy, but it's a number I'm sure we can find out.
Would you get it to us, please? I thank you for your response, and I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. And I now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Lukenmeyer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Borowski, for your testimony today. It's very compelling. I appreciate your thoroughness. Just kind of curious, I know that in the stimulus package, I think it was Senator Dodd, at the request of someone in the administration, put in there the continued authorization to pay these bonuses. Is that not correct?
I think the provision you're referring to is the one that made it so that any agreement that had been signed prior to February 11 of 2009 would not be subject to the ARA restrictions that were later incorporated into ESA.
Okay.
So that is correct, that part.
Why do you have any information as to why that would have been in there? Did they need that in order to be able to pay these bonuses legally, or was there concern on their part that they're not legal otherwise, so they put this in there? Or
I'm not familiar with the legislative intent of why that provision was put in there.
Okay. Did it have any impact on your audit?
It had an impact to the extent that it made it very clear that these would have been exempt and carved out of any of the ESA restrictions.
Okay, so in other words, it emphasized the fact that they wanted to make these bonuses available or be able to be paid to their executives. Is that correct?
There would be no TARP restriction on
Okay.
making these payments.
What's the percentage right now that the government actually owns of AIG? As you said, 80%? Okay. Since we, the people, own that, do we have a representative on this board of directors?
We have trustees. I think they advise the board of directors. I don't know if they're actually on the board of directors.
So we don't have representation on a board that we own 8% of?
Yeah, I think that's correct. I think we do not have, the government does not have representatives on the board of directors. I'm not 100% sure, but I can find out.
Why do we not have representatives on the board of directors?
I think the decision was made to manage the government's interest through these trustees instead. Okay. But again, I'm not sure we don't have representatives on the board of directors, but I'll find out.
Okay, and right now we have a gentleman, Mr. Feingold, who is, or Feinberg, who is the pay czar, who is going to oversee the payment of future bonuses. Is that correct?
Yes, that's true.
What authority does he have to do that? Where does he get his authority from?
His authority is basically arises out of ARA, which we were discussing earlier, and the Treasury regulations that were issued resulting out of ARA, which set forth the executive compensation restrictions, set forth this procedure for Mr. Feinberg. So it ultimately draws from the statute.
So they supersede any contractual obligations that AIG might have with its employees?
Well, that is going to be one of the challenges that Mr. Feinberg has, because no, it would not. For example, it wouldn't trump these the future retention payments that are due in March of 2010. ARA still exempts those from ESA's restrictions. AIG has asked for, and he can provide a advisory opinion on them, but ultimately those remain to be binding contracts. But of course he can make recommendations. He can take into account past compensation, making future compensation decisions.
So we really haven't solved the problem yet if we have a pay czar who doesn't have the authority to oversee the bonuses, and we don't have a representative on the board of directors who can direct that these recommendations be taken seriously. Is that a fair assessment?
It may very well be. I think that my understanding is from statements AIG has made to us, and as they say publicly, that they're working very closely with Mr. Feinberg. And I certainly we're all hopeful that the AIG will follow those recommendations. If not, I'm sure they'll be here.
I take that as an affirmation of my statement.
Yes.
Thank you, sir. Very quickly, as my time expires here, you've made a couple of recommendations in your report, and we're just kind of curious as to whether Treasury has implemented those. One is that Treasury continues to hide information about the value of assets in its portfolio. Have they started coming clean? Have they started to make more available, more transparent what their assets are and the value of those assets?
No, they're going to be publishing as part of GAO's annual financial statement for the TARP. They'll be publishing under the Credit Reform Act valuations of the portfolio. That's an annual process. They have not adopted our recommendation of sharing with the American people their internal valuations they receive on a monthly basis. I've scheduled a meeting with them actually tomorrow. They're going to give us a briefing on their justifications and explanations as we continue to press for that recommendation to be adopted.
Now, you've made several recommendations in your report. What do you feel, in your estimation, is the most important recommendation that you could make, and have whoever you need to be able to address it, have they addressed it, and if they have, fine. If they haven't, why not?
I think it's difficult to say because each TARP program is different, but I think our biggest overarching recommendations, which relate to transparency, in particular on requiring TARP recipients to report on how they're using the TARP funds, is fundamentally important for a number of reasons, including it fuels a lot of the cynicism. The failure to adopt this recommendation, I think, fuels a lot of the cynicism that the American people have towards this program, this perception that the TARP is a black hole. I think it's a very unfortunate decision on Treasury's part. It's a decision that was made by the last administration and continues with this administration, and it's one that we continue to press for. But I think that's one of the most significant failings because it's indicative of a basic attitude towards transparency that we find is lacking in the TARP program.
I appreciate your remarks. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. Thank you very much. I now yield 5 minutes to the gentlewoman from Ohio, Ms. Kaptur.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Borofsky. Thank you for your work. Could you please restate for the record, to the best of your ability, how much taxpayer money has been put at risk through the funding of the TARP at Treasury, and also any estimate you might have of the dollars that have been put at risk through the Fed, which total into the trillions, I am told. Can you clarify that for the record?
Sure. I don't have those numbers at my fingertips right now. In our last audit report, we put out an estimate of the total amount of money that was related to the financial crisis outstanding, and in that we totaled it to be approximately $3 trillion across the federal government, and we had breakdowns with the Federal Reserve and Treasury in that quarterly report. I don't have those numbers at my fingertips, but they are reflected in that report.
All right, I thank you. You know, I'm in awe and simultaneously in utter disgust at how Wall Street and the money elites in our country take care of one another to the point of wrapping their tentacles around the entire federal government of the United States of America. That takes a lot of power. We have 15 million people unemployed. We have millions and millions of people being kicked out of their homes. And yet we witness this egregious behavior by those who continue to receive these bonuses, and really an arrogant disregard for the Republic and its citizenry. In your testimony on page 16, you accurately state that the plans for these bonuses at AIG and AIG's financing risk division were exempted under the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act this year, which explicitly stated that it did not apply to agreements on bonuses in place prior to February 11, 2009. Who could have had the power to insert that provision, I'm going to ask your staff to please provide for the record the exact language of the provision that did that in the Recovery Act. And I'd like you to venture an opinion on who drafted that language and how did it get in that major recovery bill, which included our unemployment benefit extensions, it included the Medicaid payments to the states. People can disagree whether they like the Recovery Act or not, but to have that provision in there, it wasn't in the House bill. How did that get in there?
My understanding is that Senator Dodd introduced the amendment that reflects that language.
And basically, what is the net effect of that language?
The net effect of that language is that the TARP does not prohibit these types of bonus payments that if the bonus plan was offered prior to that date.
That's unbelievable, that this could happen in our country. And that members of Congress, and to the extent that your staff can provide the exact way in which this happened legislatively, through committee, through subcommittee, however, through conference committee, I would be very grateful if you could provide it for the record. Let me ask you this question. Do you believe that these unwarranted bonuses could have been prevented and prior bonuses clawed back if our government established through a civil lawsuit or through administrative enforcement actions or criminal prosecution that the bonuses were prompted by accounting fraud? Could we open it up?
I'm trying to go back to my days as a prosecutor just a year ago of forfeiture and issues. There certainly are circumstances if these payments were resulting from fraud that there could be opportunities for forfeiture or restitution.
All right.
I'm trying to think of the specific circumstances, but it certainly is possible.
All right. That's an important statement for the record, because I think justice has to be won through the courts to the extent that we can. And they can't be on the sidelines in this, and parties to this suit should be thinking about that, because the American people don't support this. And yet this is going on, and it's been made the law of the land. I think most members of Congress, if you surveyed them, don't even realize that that provision was in the recovery bill that was passed earlier this year. It takes a lot of power to insert a provision like that that literally puts the firewall up against us going after those bonuses.
And to be clear, as the wheels keep turning, I think what we would probably need to show is an individual employee who participated in a type of fraud that resulted and included into the bonus payment. It may be more difficult to claw back under a fraud theory. Someone who is a participant to the contract and fulfilled their obligations under the contract and received the payment, that person may be more difficult to recover. But if one of the recipients of the bonuses was involved in a fraud that helped lead to those, I think there would be legal remedies.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. The gentlewoman's time has expired.
Could I ask the gentleman to provide one piece of information for the record?
The problem is we're having a vote, and I'm afraid that some of the members might not have an opportunity to, that's my problem. So Congressman Welch.
Thank you. I'll be brief. Thank you very much for your good work. And I just want to make a brief statement. Mr. Chairman, I think all of us are deeply troubled by AIG's unwillingness to live up to its clear obligation to return millions in bonuses that are totally unwarranted. Those should be returned to the American taxpayer. The Special Investigator General's report lays bare the troubling extent to which AIG continues to take advantage of the United States government and the United States taxpayer. They acted in good faith last fall when the company's looming collapse posed a systemic risk to the entire U.S. economy. But the folks in AIG's Financial Products Division, who helped push our economy off a cliff, don't deserve a dime in bonuses that are financed by the American taxpayer. And I continue to urge the Department of Treasury and the Federal Reserve to work together to recoup this money and ensure that AIG honors its commitments and that we honor our obligation to the U.S. taxpayers. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much. I thank the gentleman for his statement. I now yield to Congressman Murphy from Connecticut.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
I want to get back to the issue of retention for a moment, but before I do, in follow-up to Representative Kapter's questions, the language that regarding the contractual obligations of bonuses in legislation inserted in the Senate. Just to be clear, that language was in the context of an amendment that limited the awarding of bonuses to companies that received TARP and federal rescue funds.
Oh, yes. I mean, the ARA restrictions, which significantly increased the executive compensation restrictions on TARP recipients, in the original version of the statute, they were much milder, to put it mildly. But this was all part of an amendment that included far greater restrictions, which ultimately created the PAYSAR and the bonus restrictions that ultimately have been incorporated into ESA. That's correct.
In the context of the amendment offered by Senator Dodd in the Senate that was not part of the House version initially.
Yes, Senator Dodd's amendment was related to the entire executive compensation structure, was all authored by Senator Dodd. If I didn't make that clear, I perhaps should have. That was his proposal to put into ESA through ARA the enhanced executive compensation restrictions, and part of that was this provision. That's correct.
I want to come back to this issue of bonuses offered to retain employees. This is a key part of your report and part of what you feel was missed in the discussions between Treasury and AIG was the lack of real solid questioning as to some of the declarations made by AIG. And one of the things you say in your report to start with is that the resignations at AIG FP have been, I think you used the word, particularly acute over the course of this time period. Because this is such an important piece of the justification, I'm wondering if you can drill down a little bit on that and what leads you to the supposition that resignations have been particularly acute at AIG FP.
Basically the numbers. I don't have the specific numbers right in front of me, but AIG has reported that there's been a large number of resignations. The reasons for them could be multifold. I'd hate to speculate. Certainly it's been reported to us that all of the attention that occurred in March and there's been anecdotal stories of people going to AIG FP executives' houses. There's bus tours that stop at their houses. Obviously, that creates a lot of pressure. Also, the business is one of winding down, and it's not and because of the very poor financial performance of the entity, that too could contribute to why people would leave.
How do we, going forward, try to get at this issue to make sure that it doesn't happen again? You've, I think, correctly laid out all sorts of reasons that people may leave, many having nothing to do with pay or compensation packages, and lots of reasons that people would stay having nothing to do with pay and compensation packages given the existing market. As we try to chart a course forward here, how do you suggest that Treasury or this Congress evaluate these claims that AIG or any other company may make that they must pay $1 million, $5 million, $10 million in bonus money in order to keep an employee, given all of those competing factors? What's your suggestions as to how we evaluate this going forward?
I think the key to any type of policy or procedure that addresses your question must be that it be formalized and be transparent. Because I think that where the biggest problems occur is when the types of dealings or transactions or dealings or advice are given behind the curtain. That creates the cynicism and anger that we've seen relating to this bailout and that pervades a lot of the TARP. So I think that what the actual policies and procedures are, that's a more difficult question. That's something for Treasury as the policymaker to determine, and for this body. But the structure, I think, is key.
I guess we need your help on that, though, because transparency is wonderful. But if all they're saying is a restatement of their claim that they must pay $10 million in bonuses in order to keep this employee, having that claim be transparent it doesn't really help us much. It's hard for me to understand, as I think it is for many on this committee and this Congress, to understand why these bonuses were merited, given the fact that there weren't a lot of job opportunities out there
for the very people that were responsible for the collapse of that company. So I just ask you going forward to help us try to chart those standards, help us come up with recommendations for Treasury so that we're not just reliant on the transparency piece, that we actually have some standards in place to guarantee that this isn't just a claim of retention, that there's actually merit behind that claim. I thank you, the Chairman, for the time.
Thank you very much. Thank you, gentleman from Connecticut. Gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Schock.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to yield my 5 minutes to my distinguished ranking member, Mr. Issa.
I thank the Chairman, and I'm sorry it seems like all my folks are being real shy today, but perhaps it's just my day to be tough on you. I'm going to try and bring a close to this this hearing with a tough question.
Sure.
Your testimony, previously and now, is that then New York Fed Chairman Geithner didn't know about the bonuses while he was New York Fed Chairman, even though it was his responsibility to oversee that failed AIG and, of course, the funds that went to them. Isn't that correct?
We haven't seen any indication that he knew.
Okay, yeah. So we don't know if he knew, but it was his job to know, and so far he's testified he didn't know.
He said he didn't know, and we haven't seen any indication to
Okay, so according to his testimony, he failed to know when it was his job to know.
Yes.
And as Treasury Secretary, he failed to stop, even though he had at least a couple of days' notice, he failed to stop these bonuses, and has said he just couldn't, right?
That's correct.
So he failed to know when he should have known. He failed to stop when this committee on a bipartisan basis says he should have at least halted it for a review and not simply paid it. And now he's failing to give you transparency, you've testified, right?
That is correct.
So we have a Secretary of the Treasury who failed to know what he should have known, failed to do what he should have done, and has failed to give us transparency. That's really what this testimony today is all about. And in fact, on a bipartisan basis, we're hearing that, one, we're not getting transparency, and two, even if we get transparency, if we can't trust the judgment and the decisions of the Treasury, then in fact we're not going to get the outcome the American people expect us to get, and we're going to continue to have non-essential people paid huge bonuses, in many cases, that are unnecessary with taxpayers' dollars or dollars that could be returned to taxpayers. That's correct, isn't it?
There's a lot of in your statement, a lot of which I agree with.
Okay. Well, we won't ask for the minute part you may not agree with. So I guess this committee is dealing with a Treasury who's not providing transparency to the IG who has called for it. And, in fact, this is a gentleman who was confirmed by the Senate, nominated by the President to be part of the most transparent, I repeat, the most transparent administration in history. And I'm sure you've heard that claim by the administration, right?
And much more importantly than being transparent to us, it's the transparency to the American people, the taxpayers who are the investors in this program. They've been good as far as giving us the documents and information that we've requested, but as far as bringing the necessary transparency to the program, I couldn't agree with you more.
So, Mr. Chairman, when we said that we wanted to go everywhere that the trail leads and to all people, I would say today, and I'm not calling on you to do this, but I'm suggesting that you and I work on a bipartisan basis to bring Secretary Geithner here to, in fact, review thoroughly what appears to be a pattern of not knowing, not stopping, and now not providing the transparency that the President has tasked him to provide. I think that the IG has been, I don't want to say timid, but he has certainly been respectful as he has delivered this message. But if the summary of that message that we've all heard is correct, then I believe that it's now time for us to bring Secretary Geithner here to find out if, in fact, he will make a change in direction of the large ship of state, the Treasury Department, to make them provide the transparency that the President tasked him to do. I told you it'd be tough. You're still standing, so it couldn't have been that tough. I want to thank you, though, for your testimony here today. I want to thank you for your respectful candor in delivering what is not what we like to hear. We don't like to hear that the administration doesn't have it right yet, and I think both sides of the aisle have worked with you to point that out. I thank you for this. I would, in closing, ask if you can look through your schedule and if possibly I'm assuming we won't do another hearing this soon, but I know you're releasing additional information next week. If your schedule allows, I think we would like to try to arrange for a less formal, maybe a 1 hour with the members, so that we could get briefed and have a quick discussion so we'd understand what you're releasing next week, if you can see if that's available.
Oh, anytime. We'll always be available for that, of course.
Thank you, and I'd like to thank Mr. Schock for yielding time, and I'd yield the balance. I'm sure he would yield the balance to the chairman.
Yeah, no, without objection, we would love to arrange a joint briefing, and of course, hope that we can do that. Not a hearing, but a briefing of all the members. Let me just close on this note by saying that thank you very much, Mr. Borowski, for your being here, and we really appreciate the work that you're doing. A year ago, with major Wall Street firms either bankrupt or teetering on the edge, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi famously said, "The party is now over." And for AIG, that was true. Only a massive taxpayer bailout has kept AIG alive. Yet, despite the fact that mismanagement and poor business decisions brought the company down, AIG's executives still insist on extraordinary compensation. At AIG, the party might be over, but the music hasn't stopped playing and the musicians keep hanging around. One of the things we've learned today is that apparently AIG's executives still believe that millions of dollars in bonuses or retention payments, or whatever you want to call them, should be paid to them without regards to the company's performance. In other words, they don't want to look at performance. They want to just sort of say, this is the way we do it. We've been doing it for years, and we're going to continue to do it. In other words, not much has changed since last spring. Now the special master, Ken Feinberg, is reviewing AIG's latest proposal for nearly $200 million in bonuses. The Wall Street Journal today says he is having trouble convincing AIG to reduce those payments. He has his hands full. We will hear directly from him 2 weeks from now at our second hearing on executive compensation. Finally, I want to thank you, Mr. Borowski, who I think is doing a fine job in looking into these important issues. I think it is particularly important for Congress to have the facts in hand on these important issues before we act on financial regulatory reform. And I thank you, Mr. Borowski, in terms of making this significant contribution in this regard. I want to thank again the members for attending on both sides of the aisle this very, very important hearing. Finally, please let the record demonstrate my submission of a binder with documents relating to this hearing. And of course, without objections, I enter this binder into the committee records. And without objections, the committee stands adjourned.